at this point, let me ask Dr. Agyeman and Robin to join back with us. And I ask for each of you to respond to each other. And then I have a separate question, which I will bring up later on. But I very much worry that we're training specialists in our world, and this is the national academies, who are very good at the very narrow issues, but are not able to capture the issues that the three of you just outlined so profoundly. So, people can think about traffic calming and measurements for engineering, et cetera, but, and if you will, desalination of the water supplies, but we're not thinking about it in a more global way. And the policy people don't have much, the deep policy people don't have a lot of content substance. So any responses, responses to each other or perhaps to my provocation?
I'll offer up something, and I think it's a great provocation. And I think, each of our presentations in their own ways have highlighted your concern here, and of course our concerns. Look, one of the reasons I'm in urban planning is that the joke is urban planning is a mile wide and an inch deep. As an urban planner, you are a bit of a geographer. I am a geographer as it happens, a bit of an engineer, a bit of an architect, a bit of an ecologist, a bit of a lawyer. We have the most intersectional profession, if you like. We need urban planners to think across cities. The engineers, you give them a problem, they come up with a solution. They take away the context often. They don't think in contextual terms. We do. But then again, I run a master's program where students are coming to become professionals. And this is one of the problems we have with professionalism. It's a closed shop. It is the keeper of knowledge. I know the acronyms, you don't. What we have to recognize is multiple knowledges. Robin, I think, did a great job on this. There are multiple knowledges. We need, as professionals, to listen first and speak second. We need to be on tap, not on top. We need to recognize that the kinds of knowledge that we have, are one form of knowledge, and that there are, just as there are multiple intelligences, there are multiple knowledges. And in many ways, and I'm going to take a stab, this idea, this critique of critical race theory is a critique of one form of knowledge. At the moment, I'm teaching a class on food justice to policymakers. Some of them are nutrition students, some of them are my urban planning students. What's really interesting is the nutrition students, ask them what a food desert is, and they'll give you all the USDA data. They will define it perfectly. But then ask them, have you ever read anything about the daily coping strategies of living in a food desert? And they don't know. These are incomplete forms of knowledge, and we need to think about how do we equip professionals with a professionalism that understands that they are not the only gatekeeper of knowledge. That's what we really need to do. And I've got a new colleague in my department who did her PhD in New Zealand. I think we should look to New Zealand, a bicultural nation, and the Treaty of Waitangi, which really set up more of a listening society, I think. You can't get things done without the agreement of Maori people and chiefs. You can't become a resource manager without understanding Maori cosmologies. We need to do this in the United States. We need a much more nuanced notion of what knowledge is and the significance of different contributions of knowledge. This is why I was pushing this idea of co-producing public spaces. We wouldn't need heavy policing of space if the public was more involved, I think, in the co-production of space. Social policing would happen. We would have inbuilt mechanisms for public safety, etc. So I think we really do need to think about this idea of knowledge and the privileging of certain kinds of knowledge. And of course, the ultimate privileging is through white supremacist thinking, through settler colonial knowledges that are privileged.
Robin, you really captured this issue of, and I have to admit, being an elder, I like the idea of listening to folks that have had a lot more experience, although oftentimes we need to be told to be quiet. So would you like to jump in? You're muted right now, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, please.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks so much, Julian and Juan, for your great presentations. And what I would say is they highlight the critical importance to understand the historical legacies of racism and colonialism as we look at the fact that land is going to permanently change, meaning people, a lot of land is going to become uninhabitable. And we need to understand those historical legacies, which are they're still present, right? But I just think of all of the press that happened in June around the Tulsa massacre, right? I mean, that hasn't, until maybe in the last couple of years, it got a lot of media attention, but those histories inform our present and cannot, without adjusting or making sure we rectify those injustices as we move forward. And I'm really mindful, and I don't remember the name of the woman who spoke yesterday, which really touched me deeply, which is that, those of us who care passionately about justice and human rights envision a world where the paradigm of colonialism and racism no longer exists. And when we vision what we want to create, there are other people who are visioning how to not make it possible, so that we're in this endless loop that we have to get out of. And so and I'm also very mindful of how government has perpetuated those legacies. And so with the climate crisis, we need a different type of leadership. And we have to vision that leadership. And for the work that we do, that visioning of leadership starts with tribal sovereignty and decolonization.
I was struck by a number of the topics of people that are in these. I mean, to have Deb Haaland over in Interior, and Pete Buttigieg in Transportation, and Jennifer Granholm in Energy, and John Kerry dealing with climate. Where I'm going with that is leaders really are important, and Americans tend to be very cynical about leadership and the need to really have diverse leaders who bring wisdom and humanity to that is going to be so important. Julian, as you were talking, and you were talking about knowledge, I kept thinking the word epistemology came up about 4 times yesterday, and it's a word I would never use in public because it's hard to get one's mind around it. But how we put our knowledge to work here is so critical in all of this. And I talk a little bit more about that knowledge issue. And Robin touched on this as well, that these tribal elders that have a knowledge that is so much broader and richer than the one that somebody who's been reading a book has.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rich. I mean, think about where I made a call for deep ethnographic understandings of communities. That's a call for a deeper knowledge, because at the moment, I mean, Juan, I'm sure you'll agree that, we rely on demographic data. What does demographic data tell us? It gives us a percentage of black and brown and, other bodies in a neighborhood, but it doesn't tell us anything about their daily spatial practices, their daily coping practices, their desires, their wants, their fears. Deep ethnographic understanding, I think, is another form of knowledge. And again, I'm not saying that it should just be the community, but I think planners, urban designers, other people working in the local authority should work with communities to produce this deep ethnographic data, which can be readily updated as communities change. But it gives us a much more nuanced understanding of communities rather than just purely demographic data. And again, demographic data is useful. It's like GDP. It's useful in some ways, but it's not the whole picture. We need a fuller picture. And that will only come about through listening. And I absolutely agree, through leadership. And I am, again, so pleased that in Boston, we are going to have, for the first time in Boston's history, and it's 400 years old in 2030, we're going to have a woman, and she will be a woman of color. It's remarkable. I mean, 22 years ago, I came to Boston, and if you'd asked me 25 years ago what Boston was, and I was living in London, I would have said, Cheers, Red Sox, and the Boston Tea Party. That's what I knew. This is an amazing multicultural city. We need a new narrative, and this new mayor will weave a new narrative. And Cheers, Red Sox, and the Boston Tea Party should be in that narrative, but it's a much more detailed and nuanced narrative than I think currently Boston trades on.
You know, the stock market, of course, is at least certain parts of it has thrown off a lot of wealth. Some of it is just crazy, given the fact of the COVID epidemic and people out of work and huge numbers of evictions. And where I'm going with that is many of the foundations' revenue, these are philanthropic foundations, their revenue is frankly driven by those investments. And they're going to be looking at where they can invest most effectively, the really large windfall that's coming towards them. And for each one of you, I'm going to ask, and this is probably an annoying question, but if you had suddenly got called up by a very deep pocket foundation and said, okay, what's the one big thing that we need to emphasize for the next 5 years, and we can fund it, what would it be? And I'll go first with Juan. And if you're uncomfortable with it, you don't have to answer, but let's go around.
No, I'm totally comfortable. I think that's a great question. And I want to thank Julian and Robin for reminding me of one of the points that was in the slides that I was going to show before I scrambled to get onto this car. I think, if you think about that question, Richard, is really about what kind of worlds do we want to live in? Do we want to build? Do we want to imagine collectively? And if you think about what the purpose of knowledge, and you talked about epistemology, and I love that because I think exactly one of the things that I've been focusing on is, what is the data? What are the data points that are used to imagine and rationalize the kinds of spaces that are built in order to produce what is considered a social good? And so in my case, right, this idea about using data to build a regional economy that was going to be good for society because it was going to produce good paying jobs was the justification for investment of billions of dollars in these projects. And one of the things that came up is that these workers were saying, well, these projects are killing us and are killing our bodies. And so the policymakers responded by saying, well, let's take this data point about premature death and pollution, and let's just kind of mitigate that. Let's reduce that. But I think the bigger point that workers were also making is, hey, how about we actually have a conversation about the kinds of neighborhoods, the kinds of spaces that we think are important to help us thrive as human beings, right? And if we actually have a conversation about planning and regional development that is centered on a kind of humanistic ecological perspective that centers the knowledge of these communities, that actually says, what kinds of communities do you want to build? Do we want to have these kinds of spaces? Then I think that's a different conversation. Then I think that's a conversation that leads us into questions about power, because for the most part, those communities have not had a say in the kinds of spaces that are produced and planned for and invested in that are actually going to allow them to thrive. What is planned is a model of development and a model of space that is meant to produce certain kinds of indicators of success, mainly jobs, mainly growth. And I think we need to have a different kind of conversation about the kinds of urban spaces we want to build.
Robin, the Deep Pocket Foundation says to you, okay, we have 50 things that people want us to do. Tell us the one thing that you would like to see us invest in terms of Indigenous people, Alaska, et cetera, please.
Well, ironically, we did just receive a giant pot of money from a philanthropic
Right.
foundation collaborative that it's confidential, but I will say we just received millions. And it's to create this relocation governance framework based in human rights. It is urgently needed to create what Juan is talking about. Like, I just think we need to understand fundamentally the climate crisis is going to cause land to become permanently uninhabitable. It's happening now. It's going to continue, and it's going to continue non-linearly and accelerate. And if we do not create this governance framework, then the racism and colonization that has been part of our governance structures is going to continue. So my vision and hope is, with this giant pot of money that we just received, we are going to be working with 10 Alaska Native tribes. They are going to receive the bulk of the funding so that they can create this vision of their future in a seriously climate altered world.
What a wonderful answer. And I'm going to confess to something. As I come out of a technical medical background, and there was a time in my life that community dialogue would just wear me out because I was not trained and did not have the patience for it. And I wanted to talk about what I wanted to talk about. And this is a demand to really listen a lot better and more. And I think what you just laid out, by the way, you had one sentence there and I could not write it down fast enough, but I loved it. Can you remember what you said? It was about what was the one big thing. No, it was brilliant. But
well, thank you. I
can't think and take notes at the same time.
I'm not sure what it was, but thank you. And if you email me afterwards, maybe I'll be able to remember.
Well, but I think at the end of the session, it's one of the big messages that need to come forward. Julian?
The most corrosive, I think, force in our society is inequality. There's ample evidence from research that the greater the gap between rich and poor, the deeper the problems, social problems, from everything from teen pregnancy, incarceration, school failures, drug addiction, increases as inequality increases. As inequality increases, our tendency to try and keep up with the Joneses increases. This competitive consumption, as it's been called. Competitive consumption drives our carbon footprint. More unequal societies tend to have higher carbon footprints. Inequality is the driver of so much of the ills in our society that I would set up some kind of fund to look at inequality, whether it was in terms of housing, stabilization, affordability, whether it was in terms of really getting to grips with some of the indigenous and other inequalities that we have. I mean, again, we all know about the Boston Tea Party. We all know about the, Freedom Trail in Boston. What evidence of the indigenous past, present, and future is there in Boston? All we have is, on the Massachusetts state flag, a very demeaning picture of a Native American. We have erased, and as urban planners, I'm ashamed and shocked that we don't even acknowledge whose land this was. And anybody who's got an email from me will notice I have a land acknowledgement. And this has grown now with our students, and administrators are starting to do this. We're becoming more serious about recognition. I think this is really important. Inequalities in terms of environmental inequalities, spatial inequalities. So I think to have a theme, it would be inequality and how we can narrow the gap between rich and poor. Societies that have got a narrower gap between rich and poor are generally happier societies. Yes. They are safer societies. I mean, the data is in from a whole host of people. So, yeah, it will be an inequality action fund. And we can do this. I mean, this is, I think what all my colleagues have said is we can do this. We have the science of sustainability. What we don't have is the social science. We don't have political will and courage. We don't have necessarily public sympathies and support. So, yeah, an inequality action fund, I think, Richard.
we have only a few minutes left. I'm going to add the medical supplement here, but the most prevalent disorder in America, arguably, is depression. And I think in many ways it is a byproduct of this. It is a byproduct of this inequality. What's interesting is the people sometimes at the top of the ladder are just as depressed as the people who are most economically deprived. And concurrent with this are the epidemics of obesity. I think people feel frankly, not being able to walk in our communities and not getting to a park and not being able to. One point you said earlier, Julian, children walking to school. Only 16% of American kids now walk to school because of what we build. So there are physical changes we need to make in our society, but the inequality, the social ones are just as and the economic ones are as well. And so in the 4 minutes we have left, I'm going to ask for a parting comment from each one of you. One, you have 45 seconds.
I think it's just going back to the point that we've made already, which is what are the measures of success and how do we measure sustainability and wellness? And people in health have adopted this idea of, community health indicators as a better measurement. And that needs to drive more of the kinds of spaces that we create in this society.
Thank you. Robin.
My comments are to the young people who may be watching, to have the courage and strength to continue to persevere in your vision of a world that is just and equitable, because it is critically important in the times in which we live.
Wonderful. Thank you. Julian.
Social justice never simply happens. We need to make it happen. Policymakers generally have, economic, technical, environmental, scientific goals. And if equity and social justice are increased, then that's great. But it's never a first order. We need to make it first order. I can give you examples, I don't have time now, but around the world where cities have prioritized social justice and equity, and the outcomes have reflected that. One quick example I will give you is the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil. It has the most advanced food security system. Francis Moore Lappe, the food writer, called it the city that abolished hunger. Why? Because they adopted three principles: the Brazilian right to food, the constitutional right to food, food with dignity, goes back to my point about humane policy making, and then social justice, a socially just food system. You don't get to social justice, you need to start with social justice in policy making. It needs to be front and center. We need to be mindful about achieving it.
Thank you all so much. What a brilliant panorama. And I learned a great deal from every one of you. What a joy it is to be with you. And I love the triangulation here, the brilliance from Boston, the brilliance from Alaska, and the brilliance from Southern California. What a lovely, marvelous group. With that, I'm going to sign off and thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.